Hello friends, today we're continuing the tour of my personal library, aka this bookcase behind me. And in part one, we covered the top two shelves. So if you didn't watch that, be sure to watch that video first because there's a lot of books you don't want to miss. And then today we're going to be looking at the bottom two shelves. So let's get to it. Making our way onto the third shelf, we have a number of novels, some of which I've read and many I need to read sooner rather than later. And we also have a nice little bust here. I got this pair. You'll see the other one in a minute of Aristotle, and this one happens to be Homer. To me, they are a little bit cliche, dude bro, get a Greek statue on your shelf type of deal. But at the same time, they work really nice as bookends, and I think they do represent, again, classic literature and a nice classic look. So anyway, I just figured I'd recommend that. If you are interested about getting these busts, let me know. I can leave the link in the description. But talking about the books themselves, the first one is a book I plan to read early next year because I keep talking about it yet not reading it, and that is Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. German work, German writer, 20th century, and a work many of you have praised in the comments. So one I need to quit procrastinating, quit pushing off, and read already. And then that leads me to another fat novel that I think people are fairly mixed about, and that is Roberto Bolaño's 2666 or 2666. It is 5 books compiled into one, essentially. It is one of these kind of last remaining mega novels released early in the 2000s. And I think it works for some and it doesn't work for others, so I'm interested to see. Whew, that was a close one. That was a close one, live on camera. But it works for some, it doesn't work for others, so I'm interested to see whether it works for me. But that is 2666, and why don't I just get these off of here before I smash that bust on camera. Next one up is Emma by Jane Austen. I picked this up at my local bookstore, and it was a stinker. It was a disappointment for me. I think some people maybe enjoyed it, but I was looking through the reviews on Goodreads because I was like, am I missing something? Am I just wrong? And I think calling it trash is wrong, so I'll grant that. But I think a lot of people experience the same thing. For me, I think for a lot of people, it was dry, it was boring, the humor wasn't coming across very well, and the characters just seemed utterly unlikable. And it just felt like a very uninteresting book. But that was Emma. And then I have 3 works from old Franz Kafka. We have, what do we have on the front? The Castle, an incomplete novel from him, but very much bringing along these same kind of uncertain, anxious, existential themes that we see in The Trial. That's not The Trial. In The Trial, which is probably my favorite novel from his. It's a very eerie tale about a man who, as soon as you kind of begin the novel, has this Kafkaesque absurd situation where he's being charged with a crime that no one will tell him what he's charged for, what he did, where this is emerging from. It's this state of, again, ambiguity and just absurdity of the situation. And I think it very much satirizes the bureaucratic way of legislation, of society, of a lot of elements of that. And also, again, this like existential crisis about existence in the world a little bit, and meaning, and trying to find justification and all of that intertwined. And then we have a collection of his short stories, and most famously the Metamorphosis in this work, but also other ones like A Starving Artist, A Country Doctor, The Judgment, Penal Colony, good works in there as well. I really like how all these, just the what print are these? Schocken Books prints. They're the ones you pretty much get on Amazon, but they're very aesthetic. They look nice, and they've held up pretty well as well. Another one would be Pride and Prejudice. You can't go wrong. I have, I think, 3 Pride and Prejudices on my shelf, partly because my wife doesn't want a Penguin copy on her pretty bright, colorful romance fantasy shelves, which maybe I'll show you guys at the end of this video, how her shelves look. But she bought this for me when she was at Barnes & Noble a couple months ago, just because she knew I loved the book, and it was a very pretty edition. I think they've done these editions, signature classics, of all of Austen's novels. I believe 5 novels, if I'm not mistaken. But a nice little edition, and when I reread Pride and Prejudice, I'll probably read it in this copy. Next one I was looking for a long time, Moby Dick. This is a Barnes & Noble edition, I believe the early mid-90s, found it at a local bookstore. Liked it, nice little cover, feels good, in good condition, and a book that I need to get to. I need to read about this white whale. So that's a little stack of novels there. And then you guys know, because I've raved about it, I have a 50-minute video talking about it. Solenoid, Marcia Cartarescu, released in 2022, or translated in 2022. Originally released, I think, 2015. But phenomenal book, one of my favorite novels I've ever read, which doesn't say a ton because I haven't read maybe as much as your next favorite YouTuber, but a lot of YouTubers I've seen are booktubers, and more experienced readers all say the same thing about this book, that it is a phenomenal read, very interesting intertwining of metaphysics and mathematical theorems and history and philosophy and different ideologies, and in a mysterious stream of consciousness. So really love this book. I recommend it to anybody and everybody. But next we got a little stack of some Albert Camus. But before that, Sense and Sensibility from Jane Austen. I bought this at the same time I bought Emma. Hopefully this will give me a better reading experience than Emma did. But I haven't gotten into this yet. But I do need to read this, Persuasion, and the other 2 novels that or maybe 1 or 2 novels that I'm forgetting from Austen. But I will work my way through her, backlog, all of her books. And then I got some Albert Camus. So I have The Stranger, not my favorite work. I don't want to say overrated, because it is a good work and it is interesting, but I wouldn't recommend go read this instantly. I would recommend you read The Myth of Sisyphus first, which is a more treatise-style writing where he's examining the justification for not killing yourself, which is always a good thing to make sure you have good reasoning for. And through reading this, even if it's confusing to you, you will have a better understanding of what he's exemplifying through Meursault and the different characters in The Stranger. And the last work from Albert Camus that I would highly recommend, actually, I don't think it's talked about as much as The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Plague even, is The Rebel. I'd have to review my notes again to give a really good summation of what is discussed here. But he, instead of exploring suicide like he does in The Myth of Sisyphus, he's looking at the question of murder. Is it always, is there a case for murder? And specifically, he goes through different historical examples, whether it's communist regimes or the Chinese Revolution. He talks about Soviet Union, about, does the end always justify the means, is one particular question explored in this book, and where he kind of deviates away from Beauvoir or Jean-Paul Sartre, who are, as far as I know, they were more in favor or more sympathetic to the Soviet cause and other communist regimes, because they were in pursuit of a more idealistic end result, a utopian society at the end, supporting the proletariat, supporting the working class, and addressing the problem of elitism and the bourgeoisie. But what Camus articulates quite well is that this utopian often never gets realized, and the ends do not always justify the means. And he has good articulation of why that is. And also explores Marquis de Sade and other factors as well. It's broken up into a few parts, but if you're interested in more Camus, I think it's a good read. The last 2 over here is a collection of the dialogues from Plato, a 1964 copy. And again, as I mentioned in the first tour, I have not read all the dialogues. I personally don't have much interest in reading all the dialogues, at least not with any level of urgency, but I have read the Symposium in here, and I believe I read another one out of here, and then the 5 that are contained in that Hackett Classic I mentioned last video, that it's 5 dialogues of Plato, and of course the Republic is also in here as well. So a little bit of redundancy in that, but a nice copy I picked up from a bookstore. And then Letters from a Stoic by good old Seneca. So if you're looking for something more, something a little bit more tasteful, I wouldn't say more tasteful, something a little bit more straight to the point than meditation, something that's not as much of a diary format. It's perhaps a little less idiosyncratic. That's more of a instructional piece of writing material. Letters, well, actually, I don't know, this isn't even as instructive as one we'll get to later in this video, but Letters from a Stoic is a great example of what Stoicism is. I think Meditations is a Roman emperor trying to live out these principles and also reflect upon them and refine them in his own way. But I think Seneca and who we'll get to in a bit, Epictetus, are a bit more of a out in the field, living, teaching, breathing Stoicism examples, if that makes sense, rather than a Roman emperor who kind of has the noble, wealthy, and kind of easier going upbringing, perhaps, but without getting torched by more well-versed Stoics. I will leave it there. But that is this side of the shelf. Let's talk about the other side. So if you didn't watch the first part of this tour and you refuse to watch it, to give you a quick summary on these books, they all came from my grandmother-in-law, or my wife's grandma. She had a ton of these Easton presses or Harvard Classic editions, these very aesthetic leather-bound copies of a lot of books I was interested in, and I really wanted them not just for the decorative, benefit of my own library, but also because I was interested in reading a lot of them. And I particularly am a little bit hesitant about whether they are good to read, as far as, are they a good translation? Are they not abridged? Am I missing any component in these? So you guys let me know. I think they're fine to read. For example, if I read Dante's Inferno, like, is that abridged in this Harvard Classic Collector's Edition? I'm not sure, but if it is, I'll make sure I seek out a real copy. But in my opinion, I wanted these not for only giving my bookcase a nice aesthetic, but also I'd rather have these than like another trade paperback, Penguin Classic, something like that. But before I walk you through each of those that I happily took from my wife's grandmother's house over Christmas, these two New York Best Review copies, New York Review of Book copies. I just made a video about these. I have Kilometer 101 by Maxim Osipov. It's a collection of essays and short stories. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I already talked about these books in the other video, so I'll kind of leave it there. And Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. I plan on reading this quite soon. This one maybe early next year, or at the tail end of this year. But let's talk about some of these leather-bound copies. I'm going to do it in a way that's not going to absolutely smash this bust I have here, which this is all Aristotle. So nice to meet him there. But first off, I have The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, good old American classic by Mark Twain. And this is a nice little, I believe it's a Franklin Library copy, but nice little edition here. It's a book, again, like most people in America, we dabble with, we read a little bit in high school, but do not pay attention. At least myself, I did not pay attention very much. So I do look forward to reading that, and along with more Twain at some point. Next up, Plato, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Get those men together. But in this we have, and this is what I mean, like obviously these don't contain the entire work of some one story or the other, but this work, for example, has the Apology of Socrates, which I have in the dialogues over there. Credo and Phaedo, which I think I have Phaedo in the dialogues and in the five ones, and maybe Credo as well. And then Plato, it has the Golden Sayings of Epictetus. Oh no, that is Plato. Then we have the Golden Saying of Epictetus. Then we have Meditations as well in this. So a decent little collection. Again, I'm not rating this guy, I'm just going to be honest, but it'll be nice on the shelf. But I'm not reading it primarily because I have it in other formats as well. Next, we have Aesop, Grimm, and Anderson. So nice little fables and stories. Likewise, this has a ton of Aesop's fables, but I presume perhaps not all of them. Maybe, maybe not. We have Grimm's Tales as well, and Anderson. Grimm, Aesop, I've heard of. Anderson, not so much. So maybe that's my lack of knowledge, but I did want to get that. Cervantes, probably Don Quixote in here, which it definitely is. But again, I wonder, is this all parts? Because this has 4 parts basically of Don Quixote. Is this the whole part? Even if it is, I'll likely get, I don't remember what translation it is, but I know it's like a red book cover with the face of a knight on the Don Quixote translation that most people recommend. So I need to get that because I've not read that famous story. But again, a nice leather-bound copy to have on the shelf here. The next 3 I'll walk through quite quickly. We have an all from Hardcover Classics collector's edition. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus on that guy. It wants to focus on my goofy-looking face. Maybe it focused, maybe it didn't. But we have here, what do we have here? The Odyssey. So we have the Odyssey in here, which is something I have in a Penguin edition. So I'll read it there so I don't kind of mess with these. Dante, we have the Inferno, as I mentioned, or not just the Inferno, the Divine Comedy. We have the whole Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. Paradiso, maybe is how it is in Italian. I'm going to definitely butcher that. And then this is an actually interesting one, American Historical Documents. The reason I wanted to take this was because it had some interesting early American documents like the Declaration of Independence, but also a number of other addresses, letters, inaugural addresses, proclamations. So just in general with, you see we've got the treaty with Russia, the Alaskan Purchase, 1867. So a number of interesting documents to kind of look at and read to understand history, especially American history, better. Aristotle's Rhetoric and on Poetics. So we have 2 little works from Aristotle. These I do not have elsewhere, so perhaps I will read the Rhetoric and on Poetics here because I do want to read more Aristotle at some point. I've just been a little bit lazy to do that. Another one, I bought this one actually when I bought the Walter J. Black copies you guys saw on the first shelf. But this is a Harvard Classic edition, and the reason I bought this copy of Milton is because I wanted to read his Paradise Lost. Now, I put that off and put it off and put it off, and I still have not read it, even though I bought this like a year and a half ago. So maybe this will pressure me to read it soon, but by the end of the year, I need to read Paradise Lost, and I've heard a lot of good things actually slowly more and more about Milton, so that tells me that there's much more to read than just Paradise Lost, so I will get to it on that. And then the last one over here, Plutarch, Selected Lives. Again, I'm sure this is an abridgment of some sort, but I will get to it at some point and read it. But for the most part, this whole section over here is aesthetics. So anywho, let's move on to this last shelf because this is where we have a ton of Penguins, a ton of different editions, different presses. So let's get to it. All right, so you are down here, ground level with me. And I'll say all of this is less organized. The Penguin's going to have a coherent aesthetic and grouping. But besides that, we have just a collection of different editions and random conglomeration of books I've bought over the past few months, really. But let's start with this stack over here. So I have The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. Just finished that. And interesting, you know, like an interesting dystopian exploration of the idea of pursuing a utopia and like the dangers of constantly trying to improve every little problem, and how like the next problem creates itself. It's an interesting novel. I think the crux, the story of like the main character having these dreams that are altering reality is a very interesting concept, and yet in some ways I felt like the book felt rushed, and then in other ways I felt like it was long-winded at times. The characters weren't overly inspiring, or I didn't find myself attached to them, but it's a short read, so it's worth reading for sure. Next up, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. I was supposed to start this instead of the Lathe of Heaven, and I'm not excited about it, and I don't want to be a overly moody reader where I'm just kind of letting that always dictate whether I read a book or not. But it's one I picked up at a bookstore, and I was like, it's a classic, I need to read it. But then I looked at it, and like the print is just so small. I'm not that inspired or interested in reading it right now, so I'm putting that off. I'm definitely putting it off, but I need to read it. Next, Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness and The Secret Sharer. Both these stories I felt like were solid 3 out of 5 stars. I wasn't as, a lot of you, and maybe I'm missing something, a lot of you were raving about The Heart of Darkness in the comment section. A lot of you said great things. I found it a little bit, a little dry. I couldn't find myself getting into it. Conrad's writing, like, I appreciated his prose and his style, but for me it was a little bit wordy, a little long-winded at times, and it just wasn't working for me. And I think that happens sometimes. The Secret Sharer was a fine story too, but wasn't overly enthused about either one. Next, 2 works. One of them I mentioned before, but these 2 editions from Archipelago Books. A Question of Belonging, a collection of Crónicas or chronicles, basically kind of like little diary entry stories of Ibe Huart, this Argentinian writer, and her travels throughout South America. Quite an interesting work, especially as someone like myself who ascribes the adjective of being an observant person to myself. She's very much an observer of the people, the environment, the occurrences around her. So it's interesting. The Joyful Song of Partridge by Paulina Chiziane. I might pronounce that wrong, but she's, I believe, from Zimbabwe. No, Mozambique, right? She's Mozambican. So, anywho, I need to read this. I've kind of put this off a little bit, but I actually got sent an extra copy of both of these. So if you guys are interested, I will do a giveaway soon. I would rather do like a giveaway of a few books at a time. So let me know if there is interest in these books, and I'll likely do these and maybe another 1 or 2 books I'll buy at the used bookstore, and we'll do a nice little fun giveaway where there's more than one winner. But definitely need to get to reading these. Next up, we have a few here. Good old Animal Farm, George Orwell. Very, juvenilia type of book, but also I think enjoyable for the young adult, the middle-aged adult, the older adult. I think it's a good story overall. I think it takes a very juvenile or youthful way of criticizing, communism and exemplifying the fears, the concerns, the potential consequences of such an ideology of the Soviet Union in a fun short story. So I think this works really well, whereas 1984 for me would have been better as an essay or a treatise rather than a fictional story. But Orwell there, Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett, another book that I feel like is kind of overrated. It was just a little long for the point that it was kind of raising about this idea of waiting, something like that. But Waiting for Godot there, Brave New World, really enjoyed this. I think this was a better story of a dystopian future than 1984. It was a better story and better characters, I think, than 1984. But a good read nonetheless. And then The Knight in the Panther's Skin. Now, I mentioned this book a while ago on the channel when I first got it, because I was like, man, I had this recommended to me by a friend, and I think it could really be a book I want to discuss, heavier on the channel. And it's quite interesting. It's a Georgian epic. It's a tale of these 2 knights, one of them being the knight in the panther's skin. And it's interesting in the way that it takes place over, I want to say, like decades from my memory of these knights going on these kind of little stories, and sometimes they're together, sometimes they're apart, sometimes they're pursuing, and one of their loves is like kidnapped, or they gotta go on these kind of quests. And the battles, the wars they're very quick. They're very, like, they'll be like, okay, we gotta break into this village or overcome something. And I feel like it happens within like 4 pages. It's not like this long-winded war. It's quick. And so there's like crisis or issue, and then it's solved. A crisis or issue, and it's solved. It's pretty interesting though. It's not really a good summation or explanation of the book, but I like these nice little illustrations, I should say, in this folio edition. It's an interesting story, and it is a very heroic tale. So I'll leave it there without wasting more dead air, just rambling with no substance to it. But then over here I have The Corrections and Freedom from Jonathan Franzen. I've kind of discussed those on the channel before. Here are those extra copies that I mentioned I'd like to give away. And then my wife and I plan to read Red Rising soon by Pierce Brown, a contemporary work that I'm interested in. It's quite short. I haven't read much contemporary work. Definitely haven't read much. I believe this is science fiction in like a dystopian future. But I've heard good things about it. I think it will be a more of a breeze just because I'm used to some of the, what would you call it? The garrulous or highly descriptive writing of classical literature or literary fiction, whereas I think this will just be a little bit like I don't need to take many notes kind of thing. You know, I don't got to take notes. I don't got to keep in mind all these different factors. I can just kind of sit and enjoy it. And it'll be interesting to hear my wife's thoughts on it as well. This is kind of us meeting in the middle. She doesn't want to read any of this heavier, overly verbose, heavier, serious books. But I don't want to read her contemporary romance or romantasy or fantasy and things like that as much. So this will be like a good in-between for us. But let me move on here. Next we have, I guess I'll just hit this little stack real quick. I covered all these in an unboxing recently, but Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann, James Joyce, Dubliners, Günter Grass, Tin Drum, and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. But let me get settled here and let's get on another chunk here before I flip it around for some of these penguins. But Fahrenheit 451, another one of these like classic high school reads that I didn't read in high school, and I read it now and I did not like it. I felt like the main character sucked. I didn't like him. I thought he was a little pervish with the girl next door, who was definitely too young for him. And then the story itself, like the idea of burning books is interesting and some of the concepts, but it fell flat for me. It wasn't very interesting for me. Unfortunately, the same goes for Things Fall Apart. I tried it. I didn't finish it. I made it halfway, and it was beginning to just be this. It wasn't working for me, basically. It felt like we were just going on and on about yams, about tribal stories, about this main character who had multiple wives and was just a complete arrogant, misogynistic asshole. And that's, I think, what I'm supposed to feel. I guess I just didn't have enough interest to finish it out. So I've kept it because I do think I need to give it another shot. And I know some other booktubers I've seen do love this story. So I will be open-minded, but this was not working for me. I have 1984 on there. I've already ranted about that before. Most of you agreed with me, but there was some dissidence in the comment section, some disagreement. But Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, as I mentioned, was a very depressing but somber and interesting work. There's some light moments, and all of you said that that's not the best book of Hardy, that I should go elsewhere, so I will give Hardy another shot. Next up, we have The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I really enjoyed this work, actually. This one's obviously, for many reasons, depressing. It's very autobiographical, and it's an interesting look. I don't want to say it's like it puts you in the lens of like the female mind, because Plath obviously does not speak for all women, but you do get a glimpse of like the female perspective in the era of, I want to say, the 50s and early 60s, and I think it's a good read, and also you get this glimpse into the ignorance at the time of not understanding depression and sadness and overlooking it. And you also get this interesting section too when she's talking about these figs on a tree, and instead of like choosing a fig, they're decaying and dropping, and it's like this idea of too much passivity and paralysis by analysis and indecision, leading you to kind of just end up empty-handed in a way. And then obviously with the name, the idea of the bell jar, like screaming out, but because of the bell jar, no one's really hearing you and noticing. But a good read, short one too. George Eliot, The Mill and the Floss. Now, I've been looking for a copy of George Eliot for a while. I bought this, I want to say, a few months ago. I've been looking for Middlemarch because I hear that's her magnum opus or her most popular work. And I kind of regret buying this, only because I'm not interested in reading it really, but I did want to get a taste of Eliot, and it was only $4.50. It's like, let me get this. Maybe one of you will convince me to read it sooner rather than later, but I do have it. I will get to it at some point. I feel like I bought it too soon. Next up, Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian, a book that I feel like I need to read again. My dude bro mind should love it more than I did, so maybe that tells me I'm not quite full blood dude bro. I'm a half breed of some sorts. But Blood Meridian, I'm very. It started hot. I was interested. I was like, oh, you got this kid, and you have what is the villain called again? The judge. You have the judge, and you have this very I don't know if you'd call it pyrotechnical, but this very interesting scene with the tent and the all that goes on in the first few chapters, but then it feels very repetitive eventually. It feels very repetitive. It felt like very drawn out. And then you get to the end, and I was like, man, I'm not enjoying this. The end brought me back in, and after hearing like a podcast about the book, I'm more interested to like read it again and see what I can get out of it. And it's quite short, so it doesn't feel like it'll take much commitment to read it again. But next is a work that I plan to read maybe November, like right near the tail end of the year, perhaps finish it this year. It's a nice heavy boy, and that is Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. Another tale of Russian times in the 20th century, which can be quite sad, quite bleak. But that's, there's beauty in the bleakness of a lot of these Russian tales, and Vasily Grossman in this work interests me a lot. Next up, we'll hammer three real quick. We got Stoner John Williams. Talked about this guy before. Phenomenal work, poignant, bittersweet type of tale following the life of William Stoner. I'm mixing up all the names of William Stoner. And he very much, in my opinion, represents this everyman and exemplifies some of the good and the bad of masculinity, this kind of stolid composure, even in the face of regret and of pain and sorrow. And I think at the end of the story, you just are able to really reflect and see what went right in his life, what went wrong, and what to make of it, what to make of a life like that. So an interesting tale. And then you have William Gass and his In the Heart of the Country, a collection of short stories. This one for me, it started hot and it just went like slowly went down as I was reading each one. So you have the Peterson Kid, which I think I will make a video on this and a number of short stories here soon, because I want to give it its due, and to do so I think I need to reread it. But the Peterson Kid is a very interesting short story, and that's what kicks off this New York Review of Books collection. Miss Mean is interesting as well. Icicles has something to it. And then it just goes downhill, in my opinion. Order of Insects was pretty bland. I got absolutely nothing really out of that. And then In the Heart of the Country at the end, if you're very interested in some of the poetics of Midwestern life, it might be quite interesting. And now that I'm living out here, like I understood some of it. But Gass seems to be kind of ambivalent, perhaps is the right word, about the Midwest. Like he loves and appreciates it and lived his whole life in the Midwest. But he also is pointing out a lot of the ignorance and at times like racism or problems of the Midwest in that short story. So I don't know, but I do want to read The Tunnel. Gass is he was I believe a philosophy professor, and so he has this very analytical, experimental type of way of writing. He's coming out of this modernist or postmodernist tradition, basically. And I'm interested to read The Tunnel. I know that's his big work, and I did enjoy his writing style. Again, the Peterson Kid was very was very sharp and very vivid in my mind. So he won a repeat reader. I don't know if I'll repeat all of these short stories. And the last work of that little grouping I had here is Beloved. Another sorrowful work, another ugly look at American history, at the past, at slavery in this country. So it's for that reason alone, it's a necessary read. And the way that Toni Morrison does it, it's very eloquent, it's very creative. The sporadic kind of jumping around chronologically and the polyphonic format of it made it a little confusing, specifically in part one. But especially by the end of the story, I came to love it and appreciate it more, and the characters I found to be so psychologically rich that upon further reflection, it's one of those stories like the more you think about it, the more you're like, that was a very great book. So that's that one. Then two more quick ones before we flip it around and look at some of these Penguin classics. How to read a book. I mean, you gotta know how to read a book before you can actually read a book. But no, in all seriousness, by Mortimer J. Adler. This has been touted on a number of YouTube channels, and for good reason. I'm glad I picked it up. I haven't read it all, but I read the sections that I think were quite important to me as far as analytical reading, reading with a level of intent. This process of reading, he does it. I think it's a phenomenal book. I think if you want to read with more intentionality, if you want to become a better note taker, if you want to, again, approach philosophy or even, other forms of nonfiction with more seriousness, it's a worthy read and not too complex to think about as well. And then Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, a book that rewards rereading, but I've not garnered that reward yet. But it was a good little sampler before I got to Gravity's Rainbow. But we're almost done here. Let me flip it around and I'll walk you through all the Penguin classics I got. All right, last part of the shelf. Before we get to all the Penguins, let's look here real quick at this little stack of TBR I have here. Now, technically, a lot of these books that I've discussed are to be read. A lot of them are on my list for different periods. Some of them are more urgent and grabbing at my attention than others. But these are definitely the ones that are like, okay, I'm reading these in the next month or so. One of those being Alexander Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, his one novel that is very famous. And then Fyodor Dostoevsky's short story, Netochka Nezvanova. This is a book that I heard about actually through Solenoid. The character was referencing, or maybe it's just Kartarescu overall, was referencing the story and the character within it. So I'm interested to read it, and I always love Dostoevsky's writing, so that'll be a good read. And then a recommendation from you all was The World According to Garp by John Irving. This one I'm very excited to read. Again, heard good things. When I bought this at the store, the clerk at the register was like, man, that's a great one. So I'm ready. I'm ready to read this guy soon. I think in about a month I'll start this. I'm just trying to balance all these books I need to read. But all right, let's get to this Penguin stack over here. I got a stack here, a stack here. Let's go with some little philosophy to start us off. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Either you want to read this book, or I'm not going to be able to recommend it to you. It is maybe not, doesn't look too big, but as far as a philosophy work, it is a tank. It is hyper confusing. You will likely not understand it on the first pass. You will need a second pass, and I have not taken a second pass yet, but I did take a lot of notes on it. I did my best the first pass, which is what I think you really have to do with hard works, is just get through it, and then when you come around it the second time, the terms, the concepts start to be familiar. You start to connect more dots and see where things are headed. But I think it's a foundational piece, and I'm not a staunch idealist. I'm not a dualist in my view of reality, but I do think there is some merit to this exploration of the role of consciousness and how we, subjectivity versus objectivity, and how that relates to the natural world and how we experience it. So interesting work for that reason. The next few here, we'll stick with some philosophy. Aristotle, The Politics, another interesting work. I did get stuff out of this, but I think I need to reread it. I don't know if I just didn't pay attention enough, or if it's just dense enough that I need to digest it on a second pass. But a good pivotal work. I think I mentioned Leviathan in part one as like, read this first if you're getting into political philosophy. I think you could also start with Aristotle or follow up with this as well. It's a good exploration of, again, the nature of a sovereign, of a democracy, and what that entails, what that looks like, and how they're supposed to represent the masses and all of that. So that's that work. Another work I've praised on this channel and continue to praise, and I think I need to go back to it more, is The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. It is the book for the introverts. It is the book for the outcast, the awkward, the anxious, and even for the people that have assimilated well into society, that fit in, that find their place. It is comforting. It is comforting. It is saddening. It is thought-provoking. The prose about dreams and the way that Fernando writes in this work is it's very enjoyable, and it's also quite digestible because it's in these little like entries, because it was published posthumously. Makes it a enjoyable read, not one you have to do in one sitting. I actually did take a few month break with this. I think I've seen other people do it as well, just because it's heavy. It's heavy, but one of my favorite books I think I have. And then Homer, the Odyssey. As I've mentioned here a few times, have I read parts of the Odyssey? I'm sure I have, but I don't remember them. In school, I was not. I wasn't a dumb jock, but I wasn't paying attention to books. Now I am, and I wish I did pay more attention. But I'm going to read the Odyssey at some point as well. I've been putting this off. My wife actually got this for me for Christmas, and I don't know why I'm putting it off. Maybe because it's a little long, it's a little intimidating, but it's literally the epitome of a classic, is it not? So that and the Iliad I need to get to, but I don't have the Iliad. Moving on, Epictetus Discourses and the Enchiridion, I believe. Just, in my opinion, if you want to get into Stoicism, if you want to understand it, if you want to apply it, if you want to live it, breathe it, see it, read Discourses, I think it's a much more condensed and straight to the point look at it. It's a deeper exploration of the ideas and application of the principles of Stoicism. So I read that, especially if you are a fan of good old Marcus Aurelius. Jane Austen, I talked about it. I got this copy, another copy here. I think this is my wife's copy. No, this is my copy because I have all these like tabs here. She did tab it too, but I think this is my copy of that. And then Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Again, a book that is better and better every time I read it. When I read it for Nietzsche November this past year on the channel, which you can check out those videos, but I really enjoyed it. I was like, wow, I'm understanding a lot more on the second pass. And so, great work, great piece of philosophical writing, and done in such a creative way. And I think he wrote it very quickly too, which just makes it that much more special. And to understand that, we have Beyond Good and Evil. I think possibly Nietzsche's best work. I mean, look at the, I don't know if you can see it with the focus, but the tabbing of this guy. I went to town last year for Nietzsche November, and I think I made a pretty damn good video on it. Yet I'm sure if I look at it now or look at it in a few years, I'll go, what are you thinking? You were wrong about that, but it happens. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, another must-read if you want to understand political philosophy. You need to read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And when it comes to the body politic, again, the idea of the sovereign, this ideal society, democracy, and what ends up forming, or at least leading to, I believe, socialist or communist ideas, you need to understand Rousseau and the groundwork he laid. And especially if you're interested, like me, in the French Revolution, you need to understand good old Jean-Jacques. But yeah, over here we have, again, another copy of P&P, Pride and Prejudice. Got that over there. And then we have a bunch of philosophy again. We have Heraclitus fragments, which are quite interesting. Again, they're some of the oldest I think, ancient Greek writings we have. It's a very quick, short read because they're just these quick little entries, but they're quite pithy, quite insightful. The famous, the river where you set your foot just now is gone. These waters give way to this. Something that Hegel built upon of, the idea you don't step in the same river twice. Everything's in flux. All that comes out of Heraclitus. We have the birth of tragedy from Nietzsche. If you're not a massive Nietzschean, if you're not trying to understand everything that he does, it's not really a must-read, but it is somewhat interesting in how he ties in Greek tragedy and explores that. We have On the Genealogy of Morals. To me, the work I'd recommend to most people. Just if you want a taste of Nietzsche, if you want to explore this idea of morality beyond divinity and like how it becomes quite, quite all over. How would I say it? It becomes quite enigmatic or uncertain. This idea of morality and where do we define right and wrong and all of that. Not to say Nietzsche has it all right, but this is a great kind of polemical examination of all that. And then that leads us to Spinoza's Ethics, which the title's a little misleading. The back half is some ethics and some exploration of morals and all of that, but part 1 and part 2 is really Spinoza's metaphysics into the nature of reality and the nature of existence and of God and all of that. And for Spinoza, this is why Einstein said, if I believe in a God, it is Spinoza's God, is because he believed that everything originated from an original substance, and then everything was kind of a causation from that, just a matter of extremely long linkage of cause and effect. And because of that, that means we're all kind of a piece of God. We're all, nature is God. Everything is kind of unified in this one way because we all originate from a single substance. It's a very rough summation of what's going on in this book, but it's a little bit tricky because it's written in a mathematical format of like axioms and propositions and proofs and things like that. But it's a good read. It's a good read. Then we have Voltaire's Candide, satirical take on the idea that everything happens for a reason, that this is the best of all possible worlds. You have this happy-go-lucky character Candide, and just everything that could happen that goes wrong, and you see kind of like the naivety and ignorance of his optimism. So just a classic, as always. And then Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. Interesting. I started reading this actually like right as the Israeli-Palestinian war was breaking out, and which made it quite a timely read. I won't get into it too much, but Hannah Arendt comes at it from an interesting perspective because she is a Jewish woman. She lived through the times of as much persecution and threat as you can get through World War II and the Nazi regime. And she has an interesting outlook on this trial of Adolf Eichmann. And I'd like to read more of her works like The Origins of Totalitarianism. Another one of my favorite books, actually, Pascal's Pensées. Blaise Pascal, one of these early philosophers, as part of this Enlightenment era was going on. Also a theologian a bit as well, but I think he really articulates the kind of anxiety and horror that exists for an individual with his place in time, questioning the existence of a God. And I think my favorite part about this work is some of his discussions on disagreeing with people, on happiness and leisure, and kind of striving for a purpose and diversions and all of this. So great work. And again, another one you can kind of nibble at because it doesn't have a set order per se, so you can kind of hop around, but a work I'd highly recommend. And the last book of this tour for, what are we in, July 2024, is going to be Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Other Stories. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't read all of the stories in here. Let me tell you which ones I read. I obviously read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I read The Raid, The Wood Felling, and I think I just skipped to The Death of Ivan Ilyich there. So there's a few others in here. Polikushka, After the Ball, The Forged Coupon. So I need to actually dig in more and read more of Tolstoy. But right now I'm reading Anna Karenina. I'll read The Resurrection. I'll read War and Peace. And I will come back to some of these short stories. But that's it for this tour. So if you guys enjoyed it, definitely give it a like, subscribe for more content. I'll be discussing more of these books, especially some of the short stories, I believe, in an upcoming video. But let me know, is there a book that I need to get on my shelf with a matter of expediency? Do I need to run to the bookstore now to get a specific book that I'm lacking in? What are your thoughts on some of these that I discussed today? What are your thoughts about those Harvard or Franklin or Easton Press copies? Should I read from those? Should I just use them for the prestige or ostentatious view of them? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.